Where is the talks?
Okay, everyone on mute.
Then they can't hear us.
Oh, right, he said, he did say to put it on mute. No, I'm just repeating what he said.
I can still hear you.
Am I to press got it?
No, no. If you press the bottom left-hand side of the screen, Isabel, for the time being while the talk's on, or if you want to contribute, I don't know what you've arranged with John. There's an icon that says mute. If you just if you press the icon with mute on it, we'll be ready to rock. All right, everyone ready to go?
Passed over control to you. Okay.
Okay, that's great. Well, as our speaker tonight, we have a native of Paisley, John Pressley. Now, before we get into his talk, just let me say that an 18th century Paisley blacksmith, Andrew Pressley, who emigrated to the New World, is right in the frame for being a probable ancestor of Elvis Aaron Pressley. Now, I'm not saying John's related, but you never ever know. John is an archaeologist by training, but for some years, after a peripatetic career in Lincoln, Dalmellington and Motherwell, he hauled up back in his native town as science curator at Paisley Museum, with special responsibility for the observatory, once donated by this very institution. As part of the Paisley Museum Reimagined project, he has found himself working on a few other subjects not directly related to the science collections, one of which, fortunately for us, was ship models. Amongst these is a finely detailed model of the dredger Corozal, which was used in the construction of the Panama Canal and is the subject of this evening's talk. Unusually, we have an Isabel McNabb, a member whose family are with us tonight and have a direct connection to the history and events we shall hear described. I have heard John give a talk before, so I can assure you of an interesting evening. John, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to, right, so I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, I'm now the host. Right. Okay, and let me just find where I've hidden this talk. That's not it. That's not it. Right, hold on. There we were. No, we won't. Right, it is there. I've got the talk open. I just can't see to share it. That's not it. Unless I do something clever here. If I do that, then that. Okay. Could someone let me know if they're now seeing a picture of the dredger called the Corozal?
All we see is Ian.
All we see is Ian, right? Okay, something's not working here. Screen sharing, right? Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing. So I should be able to share the screen. Here we are, right. I should be just taking a little bit of time to come up. So hopefully we should now have a rather fine image of our dredger. Yes, is it there? Great. Okay, I may as well make a start. First of all, can I just say thank you for inviting me along to speak tonight to the Philosophical Organisation. It's been a while since I actually last gave a talk to the PPI. I think I was probably maybe only a year or two in post, and I'm coming up on 17 years at the observatory. Can't believe it's been that long. So thanks once again for inviting me along. But tonight, I say I'm not going to talk about what I would usually be doing with my talk at the observatory, or as I like to say to people, I get paid to stare into space, which is quite nice. But I'm going to actually focus on a different aspect of our museum collections, and something that's really come to light more from the whole process that we're going through for redeveloping the museum. And that is the dredger, the Corozal, which is one of the very many fine ship models that we actually have in our collection at the museum. So this very detailed model of the Corozal. The ship was built in Renfrew, Simon's shipyard, and was launched in November 1911. And this mighty behemoth was commissioned to work in the Panama Canal. Now, at first, this might not seem too unusual. The big ditch, as it was known amongst the workforce, could do with a big ditch digger to help out. However, further research has shown that the story of the Corozal and the canal it worked upon was not at all plain sailing, and I promise I'll try and keep the nautical puns to a minimum if I can. So in this talk, I'm going to take a look at the history of the canal, why it was built, who built it, and the conditions encountered by those who braved the inhospitable jungle to cut a way through the tropical heartland of Central America. I'm also going to cover a little bit about shipbuilding in Renfrew and how the town came to dominate the global dredger market before focusing on the vessel, which forms the locus for this talk. So let's start by taking a look at the origins of the Panama Canal. The first Europeans to venture into the jungles of Panama were the Spanish conquistadors. In September 1513, Vasco Núñez de Bilbao led a party of men into the interior to search for the rumoured Great Ocean across the mountains. On September the 25th, Balboa climbed a peak in Darien, from the top of which he could see both oceans quite clearly. The discovery of the Pacific Ocean came with another realization that only a tantalizingly narrow strip of land blocked the way to the riches of the East. The motivation, of course, for these so-called voyages of discovery in the first place. The Panamanian isthmus, linking North and South America continents, was an ideal place to construct a canal to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Canals, which in their simplest terms are artificial waterways, built for either drainage management, such as flood control, or for water transportation of goods and people. They actually have a very ancient pedigree, and again, to do justice to the history of canals would require another talk altogether. But very briefly, we can trace the existence of canals to ancient Mesopotamia, roughly equivalent to modern-day Iran and Iraq, where irrigation canals were dug from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to help bring water to the desert some 6,000 years ago. Lock gates first appeared on the Canal of the Pharaohs, begun sometime in the 6th century BC, which connected the River Nile to the Red Sea. By the 3rd century BC, Greek engineers had added lock gates to help regulate the flow of water into this canal. The Chinese built what still remains the longest canal in the world, which is the Jinghang Grand Canal. Begun in the 5th century BC, and by the 16th century, stretched over 1,000 miles across the country. In the 10th century, the Chinese had actually invented the pound lock, which allowed the canal to rise in altitude through a system of lock gates, a common feature we see in all canals which are not built at sea level. So the work on these canals and countless others across the globe all shared one thing in common. They were all dug by hand. By the 15th century, some mechanical devices had begun to be employed, excavating canals and deepening harbours, but they still needed a human hand at the tiller. With the advent of the steam engine in the early 18th century, an invention which heralded the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, mechanisation began to take over. Now, one consequence of the increased industrial output was an increase in worldwide trade, which in turn led to the need to create better sea routes, deeper river channels, and larger harbours. Demand for these led to the development of the dredger, a specialist ship able to excavate the seabed. And the River Clyde was one such river to be transformed by dredging. Up until the mid-18th century, the river was said to, The river was said to be shallow enough to wade across from Dumbarton over to Langbank at low tide. As larger maritime trade vessels couldn't get past this point, Port Glasgow was created, although its location, almost 20 miles from the centre of the city, meant a slow road journey for the merchandise after being offloaded from the ship. In 1768, plans were instigated to deepen the river by building short piers, which narrowed the channel and accelerated the speed of the current, naturally scouring the riverbed and deepening it as a result. The Lang Dyke, constructed in 1773 and still extant today, went a long way to further this. And by the early 1800s, the river depth had been increased to 6 feet, deep enough to allow larger vessels to reach the Broomielaw. So with the Industrial Revolution now in full swing, the central belt of Scotland proved a fertile ground for heavy industry due to the abundance of raw materials and an available workforce with which to exploit them. Ever larger trade vessels led to further deepening works on the River Clyde to accommodate them. Steam dredgers were first deployed in the Clyde in 1824 by the renowned engineer Thomas Telford, who used them to good effect in building the Caledonian Canal, which had been completed in 1822. And Telford was actually responsible for a canal project a little bit closer to home, as he was one of the three main engineers who worked on the proposed Ardrossan to Glasgow Canal, the route of which ran through Paisley. This project was never completed, with only a section joining Port Eglinton and Glasgow through to Johnston ever built, which opened in 1810. Never a commercial success, the canal went out of use in 1869 and was closed in 1881, mostly filled in, and it now forms the route of the new railway or the canal line to Glasgow. There is a short section remaining though, visible today, which is close to where Ferguson Mill once stood. And ironically, it was the deepening of the Clyde by dredging which led to this project being abandoned, as large ships could now reach the centre of Glasgow without needing to offload cargo further downstream for onward transport to the city. So by 1852, regular dredging was carried out in the river, a role continued by the Clyde Navigational Trust after its creation in 1858. By this time, the Clyde had been deepened to 20 feet, the whole length of the river to Broomielaw, thus helping shape Glasgow and its river into one of the world's greatest maritime trading and shipbuilding localities. One of the companies supplying equipment to these dredging operations was A&J Ingalls, which began life supplying marine engines before moving into shipbuilding, setting up shop at the Point House shipyard at the confluence of the rivers Clyde and Kelvin. A&J Ingalls built hopper barges, the remains of some of which can be seen at the ship's graveyard at Newshot Island in Erskine, which is reasonably accessible at low tide if you don't mind tramping through 6-foot high reeds and occasionally getting stuck in the mud. Never mind. Working for the company during these formative dredging operations was Andrew Brown. He'd been born in the Gorbals in 1825 and at the age of 14 became an apprentice at Oakbank Foundry in Postle Park, where he spent 5 years before working for a few other engineering companies in Glasgow. In 1850, he joined A&J Ingalls as engineering manager. Whilst there, he designed the engines for the tugboat Clyde, which were unique in that the twin engines could operate independently of each other, allowing the tug greater manoeuvrability. These engines now form a permanent memorial to Brown and to Clyde shipbuilding in general, and are located on the banks of the river in close proximity to the Renfrew ferry. Brown would be acutely aware of the engineering challenges associated with dredging, knowledge he took with him when he was invited to become a business partner of William Simons at his yard at Renfrew. Simons Shipbuilders had been founded in Greenock in 1810 by William Simons Sr. The company crossed the Atlantic the following year, setting up in Montreal in Canada, before returning to Greenock in 1818. A later move saw them occupy a shipyard at White Inch before finally settling in Renfrew in 1860. By now, the company was under the ownership of the son of the founder, also called William, and it was himself that brought Andrew Brown on board. Brown soon began applying his understanding of dredging to the shipyard's output. Between 1861 and 1863, Simons built 4 hopper barges for the Clyde Navigation Trust. These differed from others in that they had their own propulsion system, an innovation of Andrew Brown. For the first time, this meant the hopper barge could drive itself off to the deposition location to dump the spoil, rather than relying on another vessel to tow it there. In 1866, Simons built their first 2 dredgers, the imaginatively titled Imouden 1 and 2, both designed to help build the Noordzee Canal, or North Sea Canal, constructed between 1865 and 1876 to enable seafaring vessels to reach the port of Amsterdam. Brown was soon putting many of his ideas on how to improve dredging into practice. Amongst his many innovations was that of the hopper dredger. This allowed the dredged material to be stored on board the dredger for later disposal rather than rely on transferring it to additional barges moored alongside. The first of this type to roll off the slipway was the Canada, launched in 1872 to work in Newfoundland. These innovations and a reputation for a high-quality product saw Simons become recognised as a world leader in dredger manufacture. Whilst it wasn't the only type of vessel they churned out, dredgers would go on to account for almost half of the ships built at Simons, a total of 225 out of the 490 ships that rolled off the slipway between 1860 and 1957. But Simons wasn't the only game in town though, and their nearest rivals in the dredger building business also happened to be their nearest rivals physically. Lobnitz, founded in 1875, was located just a couple of hundred yards to the west of Simons. They weren't alone though, and a third yard, Fleming and Ferguson, which opened in 1877 on the River Cart in Paisley, also specialised in dredgers, as well as other shallow draft vessels such as tugs, barges and ferries. Of these three though, Simons was the undisputed market leader and was recognised worldwide as such. However, all these Renfrewshire yards were too late to supply dredgers to what had been one of the greatest engineering feats of the times, the building of the Suez Canal. This canal would link the Mediterranean with the Red Sea and remove the need to circumnavigate Africa to get to the Indian Ocean and beyond. The driving force behind this project was Ferdinand de Lesseps, former French diplomat to Egypt turned civil engineer. De Lesseps, through complex circuitous political chicanery, eventually secured the rights to build the canal. Construction began in 1859 and lasted 10 years before the route was open. Suez was a sea level canal, meaning there were no lock gates necessary in its construction, and it stretched for 120 miles across the Egyptian desert. But in the years after the canal opened, both Simons and Lobnitz provided a total of 14 new dredgers for the upkeep and maintenance of the route. But we do actually have another Renfrewshire link to the canal, albeit this is a bit tenuous. One of the first ships through the Suez, when it officially opened on the 17th of November 1869, was the British frigate HMS Newport. In 1890, this vessel was sold to Andrew Coates, son of Thomas Coates, one of the linchpins of J&P Coates Thread Company. Andrew transformed the old frigate into a luxurious sailing vessel and renamed it the Blencathra. It was on this ship that William Spears Bruce joined him for an Arctic sojourn, cementing their friendship and giving Bruce a ready-made benefactor when he was looking for funds for his Scottish National Antarctic expedition. Andrew and his brother James provided the equivalent of £3 million in today's money for Bruce's 1902 expedition. This also explains why a chunk of Antarctica is called Coates Land to this day. But let's go back to slightly warmer climates than the South Pole. A canal across the Panamanian Isthmus would shorten the distance for any ships travelling around the Americas and prevent the need to navigate the treacherous seas of Tierra del Fuego on the southern tip of South America. As far back as 1534, plans had been mooted for a canal across this short strip of land, but nothing ever came of these ideas. It was only after the successful opening of Suez that serious consideration was given to a waterway in Panama. So on the back of a success in Egypt, the project was given once more to Ferdinand de Lesseps. Panama, however, proved to be a much harder beast to tame than Suez. Work began in 1880 with the plan to construct a sea-level canal from Colon on the Atlantic side to Panama City on the Pacific. The canal would follow the line of the Chagres River before cutting through a mountainous region known as the Culebra Cut. A small armada of dredgers were ordered by the French for this project, including Lobnitz's first ever dredger, the Drake 5, launched in 1883. Shortly after construction began, the project ran into difficulty. The landscape was much different to that of Suez, with thick, impenetrable jungle, tough mountainous terrain, and powerful rivers which swelled and flooded during the wet season. The area was also rife with lethal tropical diseases, malaria and yellow fever the two biggest killers. The workforce, the majority of which had come from the West Indies, were decimated by this. By 1889, the project had run out of money and ground to a halt, leaving investors bankrupt, machinery abandoned to the jungle, and an estimated 20,000 workers dead. The fallout from this failed enterprise was immense. It's estimated that 800,000 French investors lost all of their money when the Panama Canal Company collapsed. Investigations revealed bribery and corruption on a monumental scale, with a sizable chunk of the money intended for canal building finding its way into the pockets of politicians and financiers instead. Hundreds of politicians were accused of taking bribes to hide the perilous financial state of the company. De Lesseps himself was put on trial and initially sentenced to jail time, although this was later commuted, primarily as the defendant was by now 88 years old. Now, this would have been the end of the Panamanian Canal dream had it not been for Theodore Roosevelt. In 1889, Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary for the US Navy, and the country found itself that year embroiled in a 10-week war with Spain over the liberation of former Spanish colonies in Central America. Now, the origins of this are complex, but in short, American humanitarian concerns over the treatment of Cubans by the Spanish saw them putting pressure on Spain to grant Cuba its independence. The Americans sent a warship, USS Maine, to ensure the safety of American citizens and their interests on the island, chiefly tobacco and cotton businesses. On the 15th of February 1898, the Maine exploded and sunk in Havana Harbor, leading to the deaths of 255 American sailors. The Spanish regime was blamed for sabotaging the ship, and after diplomatic channels to resolve the tension were exhausted with no success, America declared war on Spain on the 21st of April. So with fighting centered around Cuba, Roosevelt realized that a canal through the narrowest point of land across the continent would provide a very quick way of getting warships from the Pacific to the Atlantic and avoid that lengthy sea journey around South America. In 1901, Roosevelt was selected as vice president to William McKinley, but he ended up taking the top job later that year after his boss died from an assassin's bullet. Roosevelt's first speech to Congress as president mentioned his desire to see the Panama Canal completed, this time with American engineering at the helm. Panama at the time was a province of Colombia, but not a very peaceful one. Rebels had been agitating for Panamanian independence for several years, although they had made very little inroads into achieving their goal. In January 1903, Roosevelt secured a treaty with Colombia for a strip of land across Panama in which the canal would be built. Upon realizing they had effectively signed part of their territory over to the Americans, the Colombians reneged on the deal. Roosevelt instead then turned his attention to the Panamanian rebels, whom he offered $10 million and the promise of US protection if they rose up, threw off the shackles of Colombian rule, declared themselves independent, and then saw their way to signing over a substantial chunk of their newly liberated country to the Americans. So Panama consequently declared independence on the 3rd of November 1903, meeting with very little resistance from Colombia, it has to be said, probably due to the threat of American military intervention. This new treaty with the USA was then honoured, and the Americans set to work the following year, in what was now termed the Canal Zone. This 10-mile wide strip of land cut a swathe across Panama and to all intents and purposes was American soil. In addition, the Americans paid $40 million to France for the equipment left behind and the rights to carry on with the excavation work that had already been started. Roosevelt selected John Finley Wallace as chief engineer of the Panama Canal project. Wallace set about the mammoth undertaking in May 1904. He found the project beset by the same problems the French had encountered: tropical diseases decimating the workforce and the equipment, the majority of which was salvaged material from the previous attempt, proved to be woefully inadequate for the job at hand. Wallace also had to contend with the overbearing bureaucracy emanating from the Isthmus Canal Corporation, ICC for short, the company set up by the USA to oversee construction. The reams of paperwork and red tape needed to get everything ordered for any work to get carried out led to a lack of progress and huge frustration on Wallace's part. So much so, he actually resigned in June 1905. His place was taken by John Frank Stevens, a self-educated engineer who'd built the Great Northern Railroad, which stretched from coast to coast across the northern tier states of the USA. Stevens' first task was to improve conditions for the workforce. Having seen the impact that poor working conditions and tropical diseases had on those carrying out the excavation work, Stephen set about building and rebuilding houses, cafeterias, hotels, hospitals, water systems, repair shops, warehouses, and other infrastructure needed by thousands of incoming workers. A process of eradication of mosquito breeding grounds also began, which ultimately led to a near complete removal of instances of tropical diseases amongst the workforce. Again, recruitment was mostly from the Caribbean and West Indies. American workers were encouraged to come down to Panama, bring their families, and those that did found good quality housing, schooling for their children, and an array of social clubs and activities on offer as a suitable enticement to stay. This enticement was, however, only available to those on the gold payroll, as it was termed. This term is actually a throwback to the time of the French construction, when workers had been split into skilled and unskilled labour forces. Skilled workers, such as engineers and surveyors, were paid in gold coin, whilst unskilled general labourers were paid in the local currency of silver balboas. This difference in currency type led to the workers being known as gold roll workers or silver roll workers. Under the French, there was no differentiation between these two classes along racial lines. But when the Americans took over, they maintained the gold and silver distinction, but this soon evolved into gold roll workers being exclusively white Americans, while the workers in the silver roll, by far the majority of the workforce, were largely non-white. This was actually enshrined in law when Congress legislated in February 1908 that only white Americans could be on the gold roll. Those in the silver roll certainly didn't experience the same level of facilities as those on the gold. On the engineering front, Stevens also realised that the planned sea level canal was no longer feasible due to the amount of excavation work required and the inability to constrain the Chagres River during the rainy season. A new plan was drawn up involving lock gates at either end and damming the Chagres to create what was then the largest artificial lake in the world, Lake Gatun. The Americans had inherited 51 pieces of dredging equipment when they took over from the French, although only 7 were able to be salvaged and put back into operation. They therefore needed more, and their first order was in 1906 for 2 suction dredgers. Several tenders from shipyards across the globe arrived on the desk of William Taft, then Secretary of War, who was dealing with the procurement of equipment for the canal. The cheapest bid was by Simons of Renfrew, who by now had built up a reputation as the go-to company for high-quality dredgers. By the time this tender appears, Simons had been building dredgers for all kinds of excavation needs for over 30 years, and their innovative designs and reputation for high-quality vessels have resulted in their dredgers operating in harbours, rivers, and canals all across the planet. So Taft sent his recommendation that Simons' tender to be selected to Roosevelt, who then informed Congress of the decision. But Congress were not happy. The Panama Canal was an American project, undertaken at great expense to the American people, so the Americans should benefit from every single aspect. Congress passed a resolution that stated that all equipment and materials required for the canal project should be sourced in America, unless the price for doing so was deemed excessive. The dredger tender decision was consequently overturned in favour of the American bid, which came from the Sparrows Point shipyard, owned by the Maryland Steel Company, even though their bid was much higher than Simons. Now, this protectionist move ultimately led to higher prices, as often only one American company would bid for a tender, complete in the knowledge that they would be awarded it, and so they could more or less determine their own prices. This is illustrated in an article in the Aberdeen Press and Journal of the 18th of September 1906, entitled "The Difficulty of Supplies." And it goes on to state, "The Panama Canal Commission is not having an easy time in purchasing supplies in the home market at reasonable prices. It's alleged that the Steel Trust is apparently trying to practice extortion. The Commission advertised for 5,000 tons of steel rails for use on the isthmus. The only bid was from the United States Steel Products Company, a subsidiary corporation of the Steel Trust. This company asked about $6 per ton for rails delivered at Baltimore and $9 per ton at Colón in Panama. These prices are regarded as extortionate." But between 1906 and 1910, a further 14 dredgers were built by American yards to work on the canal, all coming in at a higher price than yards outside the USA had tendered for. So this then was the commercial situation at play when a large bucket dredger was required to help finish excavation of the Culebra Cut. The only American bid came from the Union Iron Works of San Francisco, who put in a whopping $874,000, expecting it to be accepted. However, Simons had once again decided to throw their hat in the ring, and they put in a bid too, coming in at just under $400,000, the equivalent then of about £79,000, roughly £9 million in today's money. Simons' bid was accepted by the American president, a role which was now occupied by William Taft, the former War Secretary who had been the champion of Simons in 1906. Taft went with Simons' bid as he had the get-out clause that bids could go to foreign tenders if the American bid was deemed excessive, which, coming in at 118% higher than the cheapest, it most certainly was. News of the rewarding of the tender of Simons was reported in the newspapers, with the Fife Free Press carrying a slightly tongue-in-cheek article entitled "Another Blow to Protection" in their edition of the 3rd of September 1910, which states, "The acceptance of the American government of the tender by Messrs. Simons of Renfrew for the supply of a steel dredger for the Panama Canal seems to have created a furore in San Francisco. Scotland all along has been feared by the Americans as a dangerous competitor." A furore was indeed caused by the decision to award Simons the contract. The San Francisco Yard appealed to their senator to take the complaint about the loss of work to Congress, and even raised a petition demanding the overturning of the contract. However, this all came to nothing, as the president had the veto over the contract, and Taft was determined this time to go with the most cost-effective bid. What did result from this contract fallout was that the Corozal was the only piece of large-scale digging equipment commissioned by the Americans for use in the construction of the Panama Canal that was not made in the USA. In the Corozal, Simons built one of the largest dredgers ever to sail the seas. The ship was 261 feet in length and weighed in at 1,684 tons. If you imagine something about the size of the Ardrossan-Brodick ferry, you're kind of in the right area. A sense of scale can be gleaned from this rather fantastic image here. This is one of the buckets, which is currently home here to 12 employees of Simons Shipyard. And this photograph, along with the others of the Corozal, which are featured in this presentation, was taken by Ernest Hallen. He was the official photographer of the Panama Canal project. He documented the building of the canal over the 10 years that the Americans were involved with it, taking over 30,000 photographs in the process. So Corozal was launched on the 12th of November 1911, the launch being mentioned in several newspaper reports, such as the Belfast Newsletter, which stated, "Messrs. William Simons and Co., Renfrew, launched yesterday the powerful bucket dredger Corozal, built to the order of the US government for service on the Panama Canal. The Corozal shall be used to dredge from the Pacific end of the canal. She has a hopper capacity for 1,200 tons of dredging and will dredge to a depth of 50 feet. She will be tested first in the soft sand and mud off Helensburgh, and afterwards the stiff clay of the Musgrove Channel, Belfast." Now, as the Corozal was built to work in the Culebra Cut, it actually had to sail the very route that the canal sought to eliminate. The journey can be partly traced from newspaper shipping reports showing that it set sail from the Clyde on the 30th of November 1911, calling in at Falmouth in Cornwall on the 29th of December, and then, well, we presume it sent across the Atlantic. Don't have the exact route, so I'm kind of guessing here that it would pretty much follow the coast all the way down, taking the shortest leap across, because the next time we hear mention of it is when it arrives in Montevideo in Uruguay on the 7th of February 1912. From there, it headed south to Punta Arenas on the southern tip of Chile near Terra del Fuego, before heading north once more, stopping at the Chilean port of Coronel, before finally arriving in Panama on the 27th of March 1912. This journey totaled 12,064 miles from Clyde to Canal and took 117 days, 96 of which were actual sailing days, the others tied up at various ports en route. So this works out an average of 125 miles travelled per sailing day at a speed of 10 knots. And thanks to some new information, which is only recently come to light, really only recently in the last week or so come to light, we now have the name of the master in charge of sailing the Corozal on this marathon journey. Renfrew-born James Bartholomew Wallace, pictured here with his master and pilot certificate from the Panama Canal, was the person responsible for taking the dredger across the Atlantic. He had worked for Simons from the point of a 14-year-old apprentice and worked his way up through the engineering ranks to eventually becoming first engineer and then eventually master of the dredgers as well. And he had delivered dredgers all across the globe to as far-flung places as China, Mexico, Ukraine, and India. We do have information that he did actually die out in Panama, whether that was through an accident on the construction of the canal, not actually sure about just now. But that happened in 1915 when he was aged just 44. And I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank Isabel Knapp, who's here tonight, and Andy Wallace for help sending through the information that we've now got on James. It's been absolutely fantastic insight into his life and the workings of the dredger business as well. Corozal was the largest and most powerful of the small flotilla of dredgers working in the Culebra Cut. This 9-mile stretch of mountainous land had been dug by hand, dynamite and steam shovel almost from day one of the canal project, with a small army of over 18,000 workers chipping away at it night and day. Eventually, enough of the mountain had been excavated to allow the channel to be flooded. The last dam was removed by explosives, which were triggered by a telegraph signal sent from the White House by President Woodrow Wilson on the 10th of October 1913. It was then that the dredgers took over to finish the excavation, with the work being completed on the 15th of December 1913. And Corozal was actually the first vessel to sail through this newly opened section. So the Panama Canal officially opened on the 15th of August 1914. The first ship to travel its full length that day, the US steamship Ancon. Of interest, this ship was actually built at the Sparrows Point shipyard, the yard which had benefited from the overturning of the 1906 Simons dredger contract. This 50-mile stretch of waterway eventually ended up costing the US government almost $500 million, about $9 billion in today's terms. But in human lives, though, the cost was phenomenal, with a further 5,000 dead during the American phase. When added together with those who died during the French construction phase, it averages out at 500 lives lost per mile of canal built. A sobering thought for a structure considered one of the wonders of the modern age. But there can be no denying the impact the canal has had on shipping. Cutting out a 12,500-mile round trip round South America, the canal has seen traffic increase from around 1,000 ships annually when it opened in 1914 to somewhere in the region of 14,000 ships each year today. It takes between 8 and 10 hours to transit from Colón to Panama City, although, well, that might actually depend how you do the journey. In 1928, the American adventurer Richard Halliburton swam the length of the canal, and to date his record is the lowest toll ever paid, just 36 cents. In contrast, though, the highest toll paid was that of the cruise ship Norwegian Pearl, which had to fork out over $375,000 in 2010 for passage through the canal. That same year also witnessed the millionth ship traverse the waterway, which was the Chinese freighter Fortune Plum. So what then of the Corozal? Well, after a few more years maintaining the canal, it was sold to the Arundel Corporation in 1926 and sent to work at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on expanding and maintaining the base. It was retired in 1956 and then scrapped at a Jacksonville Breakers Yard in Florida after racking up more than 44 years total service. But to the shipyard workers of Simons, the Corozal was, well, just another in a long line of ships built at their yard. Many of these vessels did end up at far-flung destinations. In fact, the next one to roll off the slipway was MOP 210, destined to dredge the murky waters of the Rio Plata and Buenos Aires in Argentina. In 1957, Simons merged with Lobnitz as shipbuilding declined rapidly on the Clyde. The newly amalgamated company only lasted a few more years, finally closing its gates in 1963 and bringing more than a century of shipbuilding to a close in Renfrew. But the memory of the Corozal will live on in our new display in the redeveloped Paisley Museum once we reopen. It's hoped that this model will act as a fitting tribute to the fact that a shipyard in Renfrew, half a world away from Panama, built the machine which helped complete one of the greatest engineering projects of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That's, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. I'm just going to stop sharing. There we go.
Great. That was absolutely spellbinding, very, very
Thank you
interesting
very much.
indeed.
Thank you.
You know, and there's so much background information, so many photographs, etc., and kind of really brought it to life. That was really, really interesting. I've been looking forward to that, and I wasn't disappointed.
Oh, thank you. That's, yeah.
Does anyone have? Well, I take it we can unmute as we ask questions. Does anyone have any questions for John? It's going very quiet.
I'd just like to say it was a very interesting, and you wonder how Scotland would have fared without people like Thomas Telford and General Wade.
Well, that's right. You know, General Wade in particular made it very easy for Bonnie Prince Charlie to get down the road to England. So that was, he was certainly did well there, but it was, I can't believe the toll. You were saying 500 people a mile, and even 5,000 died after the Americans took over. But it's a remarkable change in the rate of attrition. How can you, you know, the Americans were actually at it longer than the French, weren't they? So
yeah, but 10 years.
I mean, they didn't really have successful treatments for malaria in those days. So that's really an enormous change. When it was all down to controlling the mosquito population.
Yeah, pretty much. They did that. They brought in, they had hospitals on site as well, a lot better medical treatment, and just the eradication of the mosquito breeding ground just meant that they had a bit more control over the disease. And then when a lot of the deaths in the American period were down to accidents as well, industrial accidents accounted for a horrendous amount. I mean, reading, there's some amazing films you can find on, I think even YouTube's got a lot. There's a great documentary which interviews some of the workers during the American phase, and when you hear some of the things they're doing, that they're carrying gelignite to the where it was needed in buckets. You knew when they went out in the morning, they would hand all the possessions to somebody who was staying in the barracks, just in case they didn't come back, because a lot of them didn't. It's absolutely horrendous. So and amazing, and the toll it's phenomenal to think on when you think it averages out at 500 deaths for every mile of that canal belt. It's quite sobering.
Quite scary.
I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Pressley, could you tell me where Simon Shipyard was in relation to, for instance, today's Renfrew Ferry?
Yeah, certainly. If you are standing at the Renfrew Ferry looking across the river, Simon's would be on your right. So there's actually, if you walk around where all those new flats are built, there's a bit you have to kind of walk around, a big rectangle. That's one of Simon's basins where they would have built the ships. So it's right there. That's all that's left now, unfortunately.
Yes. Because I think at that time, there was something like 37 shipyards on the Clyde.
Phenomenal now.
I understand, yes. Thank you.
I can well remember ships being in those wee inshots there, you know, back when I was a lad, but, you know, obviously I'm a very old person now, so it's no surprise. But, you know, I used to always see them. You stepped off the bus to go, you know, catch the ferry, etc. But, yeah. Any more questions?
I would just like to say thank you very much for including me. I used to come to the Philosophical Society with my Aunt Peggy, who had a sweet shop in Moss Street, Peggy Campbell. And she brought me to the Philosophical Society, and I always enjoyed it. So it's lovely to be there again.
Well, we're keen to have as many members as we can, so we'll be up and running again. Well, we've got one more talk this year, but we're up and running again next year, and we hope at some stage to be doing face-to-face talks again. So it's always a little bit easier to, you know, to be doing with them than it is to be, you know, doing Zoom calls. But somebody that's highly experienced at it, like John, can obviously still make a real fist of it. It's,
Another question to John. John, are there still dredgers going up and down the Clyde? I worked in Babcock's from 1956 to 1993, and I remember Babcock's doing dredging.
There were operations up to reasonably late, but not recently now. There's not certainly on the scale that we used to see. I mean, I'm sure I remember seeing dredgers there. Yeah, I'm sure I remember seeing a dredger operating on the Clyde when I was about 8, 9 years old or so. I'll not tell you how long ago that was. No, there's small scale, but certainly nothing on the, nothing comparable to what the Corozal was doing now. And again, the traffic on the Clyde is a fraction of what it used to be, unfortunately. So it's definitely a thing of the past that we see in the most dredging now. You don't see bucket dredgers like the Corozal anymore. It's mostly high-powered suction dredgers. So the Dutch are really great at building these things. Some of the equipment you actually see videos of, it's absolutely phenomenal what they do in order to widen harbours or deepen river channels. So it's definitely not anything like the Corozal. It's a shame. I think there's for all you think what these ships were, they were real workhorses, and Simon's really churned out the ships that helped to build the world. There's hardly a harbour anywhere across the globe that didn't have a dredger in it, which would have come from the Simons or Lobnitz, even Fleming and Ferguson. And there's a certain, I don't know, there's certain something about them. They are real big mechanical workhorses, but they've got a certain aesthetic appeal. Whereas you see them now, they just look like an ordinary boat that just happens to have a huge hoover of fear underneath it, which can take all the silt out of the seabed. So it's a shame, really. It's not got that aesthetic appeal, I don't think, anymore.
Fleming and Ferguson, would that be at the harbour down at the end of Burn Street?
Pretty much. They were just up slightly from that, so they're very close to where the airport area is.
They're trying to clean it up, I think.
That would be great. Well, that's true. I've got a family connection with that there. My father's father worked in Fleming and Ferguson. Never knew him. He died just a year before I was born. So he was in there just around about the time it was closing. And I think, again, another family connection. My grandfather worked in, he served his time in Lobnitz. So we've got a great picture of him as with all the apprentices that year. He'd only been 16 in this photograph. It's a very sobering thought. I think at 16, they gave him a boiler suit and a big hammer and told him to go and hit bits of metal, or whatever it was apprentices did. So yeah, it's great with Fleming and Ferguson. They were beside the harbour. The harbour's got an interesting tale, and the reason why when you pass the airport on the motorway, that bridge, the White Cart Viaduct, goes up so high is because the harbour was still operational at the time, and they insisted when the motorway was getting built that they wanted that bridge big enough to let large shipping go underneath it without having to turn it into a swing bridge or anything like that. That's why it takes such a huge rise. And by the time they finished building that, the harbour is shut down. So that's the legacy of that, the White Cart Viaduct.
I'd just like to say we actually Francis reminded me we've actually seen dredgers in the Clyde recently. We go up and down there to a walk occasionally, and we did see a vacuum dredger over near at Scotstoun. But right. I'm sure we saw a bucket dredger just sailing down the river. Oh, okay. And God knows what it was actually, where it was going and what it was about to do. But they're still there.
Yeah, it's definitely.
What service? What service that Corozal had? You think about the length of time it was in service.
Absolutely incredible. And again, thanks to Isabel for getting me in touch with Andy. And Andy was up yesterday. So he showed me some of the bits there. And the one thing that I found quite fascinating was the fact that when they delivered the dredger, the full crew would go out with the dredger. And then they would spend 3 months wherever it was going, commissioning it, making sure it was working, and then handing it over to whoever was then taking control of the dredger, and then had to make their way back. So they were given a stipend from Simons to find passage back to Renfrew from wherever they were. I think one of the ones, we've got a letter, I think he's out in Port Arthur. So having to go from there all the way back to Renfrew, and then as soon as you're back again, it's like, well, here's your next dredger. And I think all over the world, when you look at it, just this one person's story, you think how many other guys within that organization delivering these things all across the planet. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Must have been a fabulous adventure for them in those days.
Definitely.
My dad used to take us on an adventure because every time he heard a ferry was stopping the journeys, he would take us on it. So the White Ferry, the Partick Ferry, all these kind of things. It was a big. It's a shame to see how few ferries there are across the Clyde
Yeah, I
these
think
days.
Renfrew's even going to be replaced by a bridge in the next few years as well, I believe.
Oh, yeah,
So,
a huge thing.
yeah, that ferry's been there since, gosh, when? I think there's at least a charter from about the 12th, 13th century or something like that to allow a ferry to operate there. So,
Yeah.
all that history gone.
I'm just about a mile away
Mm.
from the ferry.
I was going to say that the Simon's Yard must have been built in an inlet of the King's Inch when it was an island.
Oh.
You know, because there was an island in there and there was a castle on it and everything.
That's
yeah.
right, yes. Yeah.
It's all reclaimed land now.
Mm.
That's right, yeah. All right, well, anyone any more questions?
Can I ask a wee frivolous question?
That's great.
You know how the slurry boat used to take passengers up and down the Clyde and tips? Did they ever do that with the dredgers?
Not that I'm aware of. I would be surprised if they didn't. But I've certainly not heard anything along those lines. The sludge boat, which I think it's the Shield Hall, is it? It's called.
Yeah.
I think
The sludge, I used to go in the sludge. Yes,
that's
I went over to Arran with them.
Oh my goodness!
Great.
It's still operational, I believe. It's still doing
but
trips.
don't
Have they
think-
sold it? I think.
No.
So not do anymore. It's
You just
supposed to
did
be very
not,
nice on the side.
you just did not go downstairs.
Yeah.
Go down to the room.
There was
Could you imagine
I think there was a famous song about it, H, wasn't there? We're the crew of the SS Shield Hall, wasn't it?
We used to see it from the Park Mains and Erskine, and we used to see it going past the school window, and it'd be very low in the water going down and very high when it came back. Obviously, whether it's cargo somewhere down the river.
All the ship from Glasgow.
Renfrewshire Council used to give you the pensioners free trips on that boat.
Yes.
When you got to the tail of the bank, when you were eating your mint potatoes upstairs, they were dumping something off the boat.
In a previous life, I was interested.
Got the sound on again.
Anyway, anyone else got any more questions? It's all gone.
No, thank you very much. Very entertaining talk
Thank you very
again.
much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Right, I'll leave it up to George to give a vote of thanks. George.
Thank you.
George, what's that?
Well, I think everybody will agree that John has given quite
thank you for me
fascinating
too.
and
Absolutely
insightful
fascinating. Thank you.
talk on the subject of canals and the way that Renfrewshire managed to get itself heavily involved in it with shipbuilding. Obviously, legacy of the shipbuilding. To see such a big ship, how they managed to get that and get it across the water, to think they're making this thing ocean going, because otherwise they would never have got it there. It's fascinating. The amount of detail of all the various things, the various canals, the length of time it took to get the canal done, etc. And as Ian touched on, the very high death toll. It's you're quite excited that how that would be seen, but and also we touch on quotes as well, which of course, as a philosophical institution, we've got a very strong connection with the quotes over the years. So that was, a nice wee aside. So, as I say, thank you very much, John. It was really interesting. And thank you for allowing us to record this. And if I can work this out properly, I will get a recording out to people so that they can see it again and also pass on to anybody else. So I would like everybody, as much as we can, show our appreciation in the normal manner. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Right, we
Thanks
can
very
go,
much,
thank you.
John.
Thank
Hopefully
you.
we'll see you back again sometime.